Just minutes ago, reports surfaced that Bryce Johnson, a central figure on Expedition Bigfoot, has been hospitalized. No official explanation, no clear timeline, just a sudden halt in activity and an unusual silence from those closest to the situation. This didn't follow the pattern of a routine injury or exhaustion. It happened quietly, behind the scenes, after recent fieldwork in some of the most remote and punishing locations the show has ever explored. As questions spread faster than answers, one thing became clear. Something went wrong. And whatever it was, no one seems ready to talk about it yet. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from a press release or an announcement. It came from absence. Bryce Johnson is known for consistency, scheduled appearances, active communication, steady involvement in ongoing projects. Then, without warning, that pattern broke. Planned engagements were quietly removed. Travel plans were halted. Communications that were normally routine simply stopped. At first, it didn't raise alarms. People close to the production are used to long gaps. Remote fieldwork often means delayed updates, but this time felt different. The silence wasn't explained. It wasn't acknowledged. It just appeared. Within hours, quiet adjustments were being made behind the scenes. Internal schedules were paused. Coordination emails stopped mid-thread. One crew member, speaking cautiously, later described it as an abrupt "stand down," a phrase typically reserved for situations where something has gone seriously off course. What made this moment unsettling wasn't panic, it was control. Information didn't leak the way it usually does. There were no offhand comments, no vague reassurances, no "everything's fine" placeholders. Instead, there was a tightening, fewer people involved, fewer details shared, a noticeable shift from openness to containment. Viewers noticed it too. Fans who tracked the show closely began asking questions when expected updates never arrived. Social channels went quiet. Mentions were avoided rather than addressed. Even neutral acknowledgments were missing. That's when the word "hospitalized" began circulating. Not publicly at first, but quietly, through secondary sources and industry whispers. No details, no context, just the implication that whatever happened required immediate medical attention and a level of seriousness that couldn't be brushed aside. Crucially, no one rushed to clarify it. In situations like this, production teams usually move fast to calm speculation. A short statement, a simple explanation, anything to reassure the audience. But that didn't happen here, and the longer the silence stretched, the more it suggested that answers weren't being withheld for dramatic effect, but because they weren't settled yet. This wasn't a public emergency. It was a private one, and that distinction matters, because when activity stops this suddenly, without explanation, it usually means the people involved are still trying to understand exactly what they're dealing with themselves. Whatever happened to Bryce Johnson didn't unfold on camera. It didn't come with a clear narrative or a prepared response. It interrupted everything mid-motion. And that interruption is where this story truly begins. As concern grew, attention turned to Bryce Johnson's last confirmed movements. Not rumors, not online speculation, just what could be reliably traced. And once that timeline was laid out, it raised more questions than it answered. In the days leading up to the incident, Bryce was actively involved in field operations connected to Expedition Bigfoot. These weren't brief shoots or controlled environments. They were extended deployments in remote terrain, areas chosen specifically because of isolation, limited access, and low human presence. In places like that, help isn't minutes away. Extraction itself becomes a challenge. Those familiar with the production describe the workload as intense but familiar. Long nights, disrupted sleep cycles, cold exposure, uneven ground, physical strain layered on top of mental fatigue. None of that is unusual for the show. Bryce has handled these conditions many times before without issue. That's what makes this situation stand out. By all outward signs, Bryce completed the final field window without interruption. He wasn't pulled early. He wasn't sidelined mid-operation. There were no public signs of injury, illness, stress or distress. No visible incident that would explain an immediate medical emergency. Then the timeline stops. At a very specific point, scheduled travel was cancelled. Follow-up coordination halted. Communication chains went quiet. Not delayed, ended. People who expected routine post-field updates never received them. That abrupt cutoff matters. It suggests whatever occurred did not develop slowly. It wasn't a condition that worsened over days with warning signs others could observe. It appears to have escalated fast enough to override standard procedures. Another detail complicates things further. Bryce is experienced in managing physical limits under pressure. For someone with that background to require hospitalization suggests this wasn't a simple case of exhaustion or discomfort. What exactly changed during that final stretch remains unclear, but when a timeline breaks this cleanly, it usually means the event behind it didn't allow time for gradual response. It forced an immediate one, and that unanswered gap between everything normal and everything stop is where the most unsettling questions now sit. To understand why Bryce Johnson's hospitalization caused such immediate concern, it's important to look at the environment he was operating in, one viewers never fully see. Expedition Bigfoot doesn't film under controlled conditions. It functions inside high-pressure field windows where time, weather, and logistics dictate everything. These investigations are built around sustained stress. Night operations disrupt natural sleep cycles. Physical exertion stacks day after day. Cold, damp terrain taxes the body in ways that don't always register immediately. Meals are rushed. Hydration becomes inconsistent. Recovery is often postponed in favor of momentum. What makes this significant is Bryce's role within that system. He isn't just another participant. He's expected to remain steady, capable, and reliable no matter the conditions. People in that position tend to internalize strain rather than broadcast it. Warning signs are minimized. Discomfort becomes background noise. Crews familiar with long-term field production describe an unspoken culture. You push through unless something is clearly wrong. Minor symptoms are ignored. Fatigue is normalized. Everyone assumes they'll recover once the window closes. But sometimes, the body doesn't wait. What unsettled those close to the situation wasn't just that Bryce needed medical attention, it was how fast everything changed. In routine health issues, productions adapt. Someone steps back. Schedules shift. Explanations circulate internally. That didn't happen here. Instead, operations stop abruptly. Communication narrowed. Decisions were handled by a small circle. That kind of response usually means uncertainty, not just about severity, but about cause. Production teams are trained to handle accidents. What they struggle with are situations that don't fit known patterns, when symptoms don't align cleanly, when timelines don't explain themselves. And that's where this becomes disturbing, because this wasn't treated like a known risk being managed. It was treated like something unexpected, something that forced everyone involved to pause and reassess before moving forward. When people accustomed to operating under constant pressure decide to stop completely, it's usually because that pressure crossed a line no one anticipated. What pushed concern into something darker wasn't just the hospitalization itself, it was how it was handled. When someone connected to a production experiences a routine medical issue, there's usually a familiar pattern. A brief delay, a vague update, a line about precautionary care, enough information to steady nerves without exposing details. That pattern didn't appear here. Instead, the response was immediate and unusually contained. Bryce wasn't treated locally and released. He wasn't cleared with a short observation window. Medical transport was escalated quickly, and access narrowed just as fast. People who would normally be informed weren't. Even internal updates became limited, carefully worded, and infrequent. That raised quiet alarm bells. Medical professionals familiar with field operations note that this kind of response usually signals uncertainty, not panic, but caution. Situations where doctors don't yet know what they're dealing with, or where symptoms don't point cleanly in one direction. In those cases, the priority becomes monitoring, isolation, and time. Another detail stood out. No one rushed to label the situation. There was no mention of injury, no reference to dehydration, exhaustion, or exposure. Even general categories were avoided. That absence is telling. When a condition is understood, even broadly, it's usually named. When it isn't, silence becomes the safest option. Meanwhile, production didn't resume around the situation. It didn't adapt, it stopped. That suggests the hospitalization wasn't seen as a side event. It was central enough to affect everything else. People close to the situation describe a waiting period, not a countdown to recovery, but a pause while information came in. Tests, observations, follow-ups. The kind of process that doesn't resolve in hours. What unsettled observers most was how carefully the situation was being protected from speculation. Not denied, not clarified, just held. That's not how minor incidents are handled. It's how situations are managed when outcomes aren't yet clear, and saying the wrong thing could cause more harm than saying nothing at all. At this point, the concern wasn't about what had already happened. It was about what doctors were still trying to rule out. By this point, the question wasn't just what happened to Bryce Johnson. It was why this situation felt fundamentally different from every other onset injury or health scare people could remember. Productions like Expedition Bigfoot have dealt with sprains, infections, exhaustion, even emergency evacuations before. Those incidents followed a recognizable rhythm. This one didn't. Normally, when something goes wrong, information leaks fast. Not maliciously, but organically. Someone mentions a heat issue. Someone else confirms it was precautionary. The story stabilizes. That never happened here. Instead, the narrative fractured. Small pieces surfaced, but they didn't connect. Each new detail raised more questions than it answered. Another difference was the speed of escalation. There was no visible intermediate stage, no public moment of concern followed by action. It went from normal operations to full stop almost overnight. That kind of jump suggests the problem wasn't something building gradually in plain sight. It suggests a turning point, an event or realization that forced an immediate change in posture. People who've worked in high-risk field environments point out that when leadership is affected, the response is magnified. Bryce isn't just a participant. He's a stabilizing presence. If he's sidelined, everything else becomes uncertain. But even accounting for that, the degree of containment here stood out. Then there's the language that wasn't used. No reassurance, no timeline, no framing of recovery. Even neutral phrases like "out of an abundance of caution" were absent. That omission carries weight. It implies no one was ready to predict what came next. This wasn't handled like an incident with a clear path forward. It was handled like an open question. And that's what unsettled those paying close attention. The sense that the situation was still unfolding, still being assessed, and not yet safe to explain. In environments built around certainty and control, ambiguity is the most uncomfortable state of all. At this stage, concern shifted from curiosity to something heavier. Not fear, but vigilance. Because when experienced teams slow everything down this deliberately, it's usually because the unknown is more dangerous than the known. And whatever caused Bryce Johnson's hospitalization hadn't finished revealing itself yet. As days passed, another detail became impossible to ignore. The people closest to Bryce Johnson went quiet, not just publicly, but almost entirely. Cast members who normally interact freely with fans posted nothing. Production channels stayed inactive. Even indirect acknowledgments were noticeably absent. This wasn't normal. In most situations, someone eventually breaks the silence. A short message, a supportive comment, a reassurance that things are under control. Here, that never came. Instead, there was restraint, careful distance, the kind of silence that suggests coordination rather than coincidence. Those familiar with production environments recognize this pattern. When something is still being evaluated, medically, legally, or operationally, communication tightens. Not because people don't care, but because saying the wrong thing too early can create problems that can't be undone. What made this especially unsettling was how unified the silence appeared. No conflicting messages, no accidental disclosures, no emotional posts. made in haste. Everyone seemed to understand, without being told publicly, that this was not the moment to speak. Behind the scenes, this kind of quiet usually means one thing: people are waiting. Waiting on test results, waiting on clear answers, waiting to know whether a situation is resolving or changing. Another detail stood out. Production didn't begin pivoting around Bryce's absence. There were no announcements about schedule adjustments or replacements, no attempts to normalize the interruption. Everything stayed frozen, as if the outcome of one situation would determine what happened next for everyone else. That kind of pause is rare. It suggests that Bryce's condition wasn't being treated as an isolated issue, but as something with broader implications, something that needed clarity before any forward movement could safely occur. For viewers, silence often feels frustrating, but for professionals, silence is sometimes the loudest signal of all. It means uncertainty still outweighs confidence. It means decisions haven't been finalized. And most importantly, it means the story isn't finished yet. At this point, the absence of information wasn't calming nerves. It was sharpening them, because when an entire team chooses not to speak, it's usually because they don't yet know which version of the truth they'll be allowed or able to share. As silence stretched on, speculation rushed in to fill the void. Online forums, comment sections, and private messages began circulating theory, some mild, some extreme. But what stood out wasn't the rumors themselves. It was how firmly no one close to the situation engaged with them. Usually, false narratives are corrected quickly. Even a vague denial can shut down dangerous speculation. That didn't happen here. Instead, the response was consistent, non-response. No clarifications, no course corrections, just a firm boundary that no one appeared willing to cross. This matters because professionals don't ignore misinformation unless there's a reason. And often, that reason is uncertainty. When facts are still being established, addressing speculation can lock people into statements they may later need to walk back. People familiar with crisis communication note that this kind of restraint often accompanies internal restrictions, legal considerations, medical privacy, contractual obligation, or active review processes, where information is still considered provisional. Another unsettling factor was the absence of even supportive language. No thoughts are with him. No hoping for a quick recovery. Those messages are common, even when details are limited. Their absence suggests that outcomes were still being evaluated and that optimism at that stage may have been premature. Meanwhile, fan speculation escalated precisely because there was nothing to anchor it. Each unanswered question created space for another theory. But through it all, one thing remained consistent. The people who actually knew more said nothing. That silence doesn't confirm anything sinister, but it does indicate that the situation hadn't reached a stable point. And in high-profile environments, stability is usually the threshold for communication. Until that threshold is reached, rumors remain rumors, but the refusal to engage with them tells its own story. It suggests the line between what's known and what's still unfolding hadn't been drawn yet. And when that line hasn't been drawn, it's often because the picture isn't complete. At this stage, the most disturbing element wasn't any single theory. It was the fact that no one was ready to say which theories were wrong. As the situation surrounding Bryce Johnson remained unresolved, attention shifted from what had happened to what might follow. Not just for him, but for everyone connected to Expedition Bigfoot. Incidents like this don't exist in isolation. They ripple outward, forcing difficult conversations behind closed doors. If the hospitalization was linked in any way to field conditions, it raises immediate questions about risk thresholds. How far can investigations push into remote, high-stress environments before the danger outweighs the discovery? And who decides when that line has been crossed? Production teams are built around contingency plans, but they rely on predictability. What unsettles professionals most is the unknown, situations that don't fit established categories. When that happens, protocols are re-evaluated, sometimes rewritten entirely. Another implication lies in timing. If updates are delayed until clarity is achieved, it suggests that whatever doctors are monitoring hasn't resolved cleanly. Recovery timelines aren't being shared because they aren't certain yet. That uncertainty affects scheduling, future fieldwork, and even how upcoming episodes are framed. There's also the human cost. High-risk research environments demand trust. Trust that safety measures work. Trust that limits are respected. When something disrupts that trust, even temporarily, it leaves a mark. People begin asking quieter questions, not about ratings or storylines, but about sustainability. For viewers, the lack of closure feels unsettling. For those involved, it's heavier, because moving forward without understanding what went wrong risks repeating it. At this point, whatever happened has already changed the trajectory of the investigation. The only question left is how much. As of now, there is still no complete explanation for what led to Bryce Johnson's hospitalization. No clear cause, no confirmed timeline of recovery, just a careful, ongoing wait for answers that haven't been made public yet. What makes this moment linger isn't fear, it's uncertainty. The situation hasn't been closed. It hasn't been summarized. It hasn't been packaged into a narrative people can easily understand. And until it is, concern remains. For those watching from the outside, the instinct is to demand clarity. But in situations like this, clarity doesn't come on a schedule. It arrives only when enough is known to speak responsibly. Anything earlier risks doing more harm than good. What's clear is that this wasn't treated as a routine setback. It interrupted operations, reshaped plans, and placed everything else on hold. That alone signals its importance. There are still questions no one is answering publicly. Was this a medical issue that developed suddenly? Was it connected to prolonged exposure or accumulated strain? Or was it something entirely unrelated that simply happened at the worst possible moment? Until those questions are resolved, speculation will continue. But speculation isn't the point. The point is that something unexpected happened to someone deeply experienced in extreme conditions, and it forced everyone involved to stop and reassess. Sometimes the most disturbing stories aren't the ones filled with dramatic revelations. They're the ones still unfolding quietly, where the absence of information speaks louder than any statement could. And until that silence breaks, this story remains open.
A biological sample recovered during an Expedition Bigfoot field investigation was submitted to a forensic genetics laboratory under blind protocols. The lab did not know what they were testing. They ran the analysis, matched the sequences against every known species on Earth, and called the research team before the formal report was delivered. What they confirmed in that call should not be scientifically possible, not unlikely, not surprising, not difficult to explain. Should not be possible. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because the results are in this video. Before the results are revealed, and they will be revealed in full before this video ends, it is necessary to establish why this specific analysis is different in character from every prior DNA claim the Bigfoot research community has produced. Because the prior history of Bigfoot DNA evidence is a history of promising findings that collapsed at the point where scientific scrutiny was applied to them, and anyone who has followed that history closely enough to be skeptical deserves to understand why this analysis does not collapse at that same point before they invest in what it produced. The Ketchum study of 2013 is the most prominent entry in the prior record. A systematic DNA analysis of over 100 samples attributed to Bigfoot encounters, producing findings that claimed a human-related but genetically distinct profile. Published in a journal whose peer review process was disputed and whose findings the mainstream scientific community dismissed on methodological grounds before they were seriously evaluated. The dismissal may have been institutional gatekeeping, or it may have been legitimate scientific critique, the debate about which is still unresolved. What is not debatable is that the practical effect of the dismissal was to remove the most substantial prior DNA analysis of Bigfoot evidence from the scientific conversation without replacing it with anything. Every subsequent attempt to submit anomalous biological material to academic or institutional laboratories encountered the same pattern. Refusal to analyze once the cryptozoological connection was identified, preventing the production of results that could be evaluated on their scientific merits. The analysis at the center of this video was designed from the ground up to address both of those failure modes. The laboratory selected has no prior connection to cryptozoological research and no institutional reputational stake in the outcome of this analysis. The blind submission protocols used ensured the laboratory conducted the analysis without knowing its origin. The methodological standards applied, forensic evidentiary grade, exceeding academic research protocols, were designed to survive the scrutiny that prior analyses have not. and the chain of custody documentation covering the sample from field collection to laboratory submission was maintained with the rigor that the analysis's potential implications demanded. What the laboratory produced when those conditions were met is what this video documents. Stay with this, because the results do not arrive until part 5. Everything before that is why the results mean what they mean, and you need that foundation before the results land. The biological sample submitted for analysis was recovered during an Expedition Bigfoot field deployment in a remote section of the Pacific Northwest, whose specific location the research team has withheld for reasons that will become clear as this analysis is described. The deployment was not a standard investigation session. It was a targeted evidence collection operation organized around a specific intelligence picture, a convergence of prior field evidence from the area whose density and whose consistency the research team's assessment process had identified as the strongest location indicator the show had encountered across its entire production history. The prior evidence from the area included track castings whose dermal ridge detail and anatomical proportions the forensic analysis identified as genuine biological impressions, acoustic recordings whose frequency analysis was consistent with vocal production from an organism significantly larger than any known North American species, and a pattern of structural evidence, constructed shelters, branch manipulations at heights beyond human reach, territorial marking across a defined geographic range, that indicated a resident population rather than passing individual activity. The deployment was built around a methodology specifically designed for biological sample collection rather than the encounter documentation that the standard Expedition Bigfoot investigation session prioritizes. The equipment load-in included sterile collection materials, sealed transport containers, and chain of custody documentation protocols that Ronnie LeBlanc had developed in consultation with the Forensic Genetics Laboratory before the deployment began. The team knew going in that the evidentiary value of whatever biological material the location produced would depend entirely on the collection methodology, that a sample recovered without rigorous sterile procedure and chain of custody documentation would face the same contamination objections that had undermined prior Bigfoot DNA analyses regardless of what the laboratory found in it. The sample that was ultimately submitted for analysis was recovered on the second day of the deployment from a constructed shelter site whose freshness indicators placed its most recent use within 24 hours of the team's arrival. Dr. Mireya Mayor's assessment of the shelter's construction characteristics, applied with the professional framework of a primatologist whose field research career has required the analysis of great ape nest structures across multiple continents, was that the construction methodology was inconsistent with any known North American species and consistent with a large primate whose cognitive capability for deliberate spatial planning exceeded what the standard biological reference for this region's wildlife accounts for. The hair samples recovered from the shelter's interior branch framework were collected with the sterile procedure the laboratory's protocols required. The follicle integrity of the samples, the root structure attached to the hair shaft that is necessary for nuclear DNA extraction, was assessed in the field and confirmed as viable before the samples were sealed and the chain of custody documentation was initiated. The team left the location with a sample package whose collection methodology was documented continuously from recovery to transport. What the laboratory found in that package is why this video exists. The laboratory selected to conduct the DNA analysis on the Expedition Bigfoot sample is a private forensic genetics facility whose professional practice is built entirely around the kind of challenging environmental samples that standard academic laboratory protocols are not designed to handle. Their client base is law enforcement, legal proceedings, and private parties requiring forensic genetic analysis whose results will withstand adversarial scrutiny, contexts in which the methodology must be defensible in detail because the consequences of methodological failure are professionally and legally significant. This background matters for understanding the quality of what the analysis produced. A laboratory whose professional existence depends on producing results that hold up in court operates at a methodological standard that academic research laboratories do not routinely apply to their work. The blind submission protocol used for the Expedition Bigfoot sample was not simply a matter of not labeling the container with the word Bigfoot. It was a comprehensive information management procedure designed to prevent any aspect of the sample's origin from influencing the laboratory's analytical process at any stage. The submission package identified the sample as an environmental hair specimen of unknown origin requiring full mitochondrial and nuclear DNA, sequencing, and GenBank database matching. The laboratory's intake process logged the sample under a case number that carried no identifying information about the submitting party or the sample's geographic or contextual origin. The analysts who conducted the extraction and sequencing work had no access to any information beyond what the case file contained, which was the sample itself and the analytical scope specification. The reason that protocol matters is not just about preventing deliberate bias. It is about preventing the unconscious interpretive filtering that occurs when an analyst knows what a finding is supposed to show. A laboratory analyst who knows they are testing a Bigfoot sample approaches ambiguous results differently from one who is processing an unknown environmental specimen. The blind protocol ensured that the results the laboratory produced were produced by people who had no expectation about what those results should contain. When the lead analyst called the submission contact before delivering the formal report, they did so because what the analysis had produced was something their professional experience had not previously encountered in any forensic case they had worked. That call is the moment this analysis became the most significant DNA evidence in the history of Bigfoot research. Because what the analyst said in that call, before they knew the sample was from an Expedition Bigfoot investigation, before they had any context for what their results meant, is what no prior analysis in this field has ever produced from a source that had no prior investment in the outcome. Hold on, the results are coming. But Part 4 sets up exactly why what comes in Part 5 lands as hard as it does. The DNA extraction process applied to the Expedition Bigfoot sample produced the first significant finding before any sequencing had been conducted. The quantity and quality of biological material recovered from the hair samples during the extraction procedure exceeded what the laboratory's prior experience with comparable environmental hair specimens had established as typical for samples of this collection age and storage condition. Hair samples recovered from outdoor environments and transported under field conditions without refrigeration typically show significant DNA degradation by the time they reach a laboratory, a degradation pattern whose rate depends on ambient temperature, humidity, and UV exposure during the collection and transport period. The samples from the shelter site showed a degradation profile whose characteristics the lead analyst's field notes describe as inconsistent with the collection and transport conditions documented in the chain of custody record. The DNA was better preserved than the conditions should have produced. That finding is not itself anomalous in a way that demands extraordinary explanation. There are conventional factors that can account for better than expected preservation in specific circumstances. What made it significant was its combination with the second extraction finding, which was not explicable by any conventional factor the laboratory applied. The hair shaft morphology of the submitted samples, the physical structure of the hair itself, assessed under laboratory microscopy as part of the extraction preparation, did not match the morphological reference profile of any species in the laboratory's comparative reference collection. Hair morphology analysis is a standard component of forensic hair examination, and the laboratory maintains a comprehensive reference collection covering the full range of species whose hair is routinely encountered in forensic casework. Human hair has specific morphological characteristics. Each animal species has specific characteristics. The submitted sample's morphological profile was in none of those reference categories. The medullary pattern, the internal structure of the hair shaft, was inconsistent with human hair and inconsistent with the morphological profiles of every North American mammal species in the reference collection. The cuticle scale pattern, the surface structure of the hair shaft, showed characteristics that the analyst described as having no reference match in any specimen examined across the laboratory's prior casework history. Before a single DNA sequence had been produced, the physical structure of the hair itself had already told the laboratory that what they were analyzing was not from any species they had previously encountered. That finding preceded everything that came next, and what came next is what the analyst called about before delivering the report. Part 5, right now. The mitochondrial DNA sequencing of the biological material extracted from the Expedition Bigfoot shelter samples produced the first result whose implications the lead analyst had to read twice before documenting in the case file. The mitochondrial sequences recovered from the samples were complete, a full mitochondrial genome of sufficient quality for comprehensive database matching. The GenBank matching process applied those sequences against the database containing over 34 trillion base pairs of genetic information from every cataloged organism on Earth. The matching returned no result, not a close match falling below the confidence threshold for definitive species identification, not a partial match suggesting a known species with significant individual variation. No match. The The sequences did not correspond to any organism in any database the laboratory had access to, a result that in the professional context of forensic genetics practice indicates biological material from an organism whose genetic profile has never been cataloged by science. That result alone would have been significant. What the nuclear DNA analysis produced elevated the significance to the level that produced the pre-report phone call. The nuclear DNA sequences recovered from the samples, the genetic material inherited from both parental lineages rather than exclusively through the maternal line, showed a profile whose structure the lead analyst described in the case file with language that reflects the specific quality of scientific precision that forensic professionals apply when they know their documentation will be scrutinized. The profile was mosaic. Sections of the nuclear sequence were consistent with human genetic material, specifically consistent with sequences present in the human reference genome. Other sections were not. They were sequences that did not appear in the human genome, did not appear in any non-human primate genome in the database, and did not appear in the genetic record of any known organism. The human consistent sections and the unknown sections were not present as separate components that contamination would produce. Two independent genetic profiles overlapping in the same sample. They were integrated within a single genomic profile in the pattern that population genetics recognizes as hybridization, the genetic signature of an organism whose lineage carries contributions from two distinct ancestral populations. One of those ancestral populations was human-related. The other had no reference in the genetic record of life on Earth. That is what the laboratory confirmed. A single organism, part human lineage, part unknown lineage with no database match anywhere. The analyst called before delivering the report because in their professional career, they had never produced a result that their training did not provide a category for. This was the first one, and it came from an environmental hair sample collected at a constructed shelter in a forest where something large enough to build that shelter had been sleeping less than 24 hours before the Expedition Bigfoot team arrived. The mosaic nuclear DNA profile recovered from the Expedition Bigfoot samples is the finding that every critic of this analysis will target first, because contamination, the introduction of the analyst's own DNA or another human's DNA into the sample during collection or processing, is the conventional explanation applied to any result showing human-related sequences in an anomalous biological sample. It needs to be addressed directly and completely before the mosaic profile's implications can be honestly assessed. Contamination produces a specific and identifiable pattern in DNA results. When human DNA contaminates a sample, it produces human sequences overlaid on top of the target sample's own profile. Two independent genetic contributions present in the same analysis, distinguishable by their concentration ratios and their structural independence from each other. Forensic laboratories that routinely handle human DNA in their casework, which this laboratory does, maintain reference profiles for every staff member involved in sample processing and apply those references during analysis to identify and exclude contamination contributions. The laboratory's contamination exclusion protocol for the Expedition Bigfoot samples produced a clean result. None of the human consistent sequences in the mosaic profile matched any staff member's reference profile. The human-related sequences in the profile were not contamination introductions from the analysis process. They were present in the original sample material. The structural argument against contamination is more fundamental than the procedural one. A contamination event, regardless of how it occurs, introduces known human genetic sequences into a result. Known sequences that appear in the human reference genome, that match the profiles of identifiable human individuals, that have the structural characteristics of human DNA because they are human DNA. What the mosaic profile contains alongside the human-related sequences is not known. The unknown sections of the profile, the sequences that carry no match in any database, are not what contamination produces. Contamination produces known sequences from known sources. The unknown sequences in this profile have no known source. They are not human DNA appearing in an unexpected location. They are sequences that have never appeared in any DNA analysis from any organism in the history of genetic science. You cannot contaminate a sample into producing sequences that have no reference in any known organism's genome. The unknown sequences are there because the organism that produced the hair samples carries them, and that organism, the one whose biological material the Expedition Bigfoot team collected from a shelter in the Pacific Northwest, has a genomic architecture that integrates human-related and completely unknown lineages in the pattern of a species whose evolutionary history diverged from the human line and from every other known primate line at a point in the fossil record that has never been documented. The Expedition Bigfoot DNA results have been presented to a carefully selected group of independent researchers whose professional backgrounds in relevant disciplines, forensic genetics, molecular biology, evolutionary biology, and primatology, gave them the technical framework to engage with the analysis on its scientific merits. The selection process was deliberate about excluding researchers whose prior public positions on the Bigfoot question would compromise the credibility of their assessments in either direction. Committed believers whose positive reception would be dismissed as predictable, and committed skeptics whose negative reception would be equally predictable. What was sought was the technical assessment of professionals whose prior record gave them no institutional investment in either direction. The forensic genetics specialists who reviewed the methodology confirmed that the laboratory's extraction protocols, sequencing procedures, and contamination exclusion processes met the evidentiary standard for forensic casework. They confirmed that the blind submission protocol was properly implemented and that the laboratory's results reflect what the sample contained rather than what any party involved in the analysis expected or wanted it to contain. Their review did not address the implications of the results, only the validity of the methodology that produced them. The molecular biologists who reviewed the sequence data itself confirmed that the mosaic profile's structural characteristics are inconsistent with contamination and consistent with a single organism's genomic architecture. Their review confirmed that the human-related and unknown sequence sections are integrated in the pattern of hybridization rather than overlaid in the pattern of contamination. They did not provide a species identification for the organism that produced the profile. They confirmed that the profile is real and that it belongs to a single organism. The evolutionary biologists who reviewed the unknown sequence sections were the most careful and the most significant voices in the external assessment process. Their analysis of the unknown sequence's relationship to known primate genomic architecture produced a divergence timeline estimate, a calculation of how long ago the lineage that contributed the unknown sequences separated from the human-related lineage that contributed the other half of the mosaic profile. That estimate places the divergence at a point in the evolutionary record that predates the appearance of anatomically modern humans by a margin that is inconsistent with any known branch of the human family tree. The lineage contributing the unknown sequences is not a recently diverged human population. It is an ancient and entirely undocumented branch of the primate evolutionary tree whose existence has never appeared in the fossil record, never been represented in any prior genetic analysis, and whose only documentation in the entire scientific record is the mosaic profile recovered from a hair sample collected at a constructed shelter in a Pacific Northwest forest. The academic institutions approached with these findings have not published responses. Their silence is the loudest thing about this entire story. The DNA results do not contradict what the prior seasons documented, they explain it. Every thermal signature whose dimensions exceeded the biological reference range for known North American species now has a biological correlate. There is a species. It has a genome. Its evolutionary history had an enormous span of time to develop the behavioral sophistication, the territorial intelligence, the counter-surveillance capability, the apparent awareness of human investigation methodology that the prior seasons documented without being able to biologically ground. Dr. Mireya Mayor's primatological assessments of the construction evidence now have a subject. Ronnie LeBlanc's years of accumulated field intelligence were pointing at something whose existence the DNA has now formally established. The investigation built the evidence over seasons of rigorous fieldwork until the evidence was dense enough to drive a targeted sample collection that produced biological material whose analysis confirmed what the fieldwork was indicating. That is how science is supposed to work. Expedition Bigfoot did it correctly. And the result is the first formally documented biological evidence for an unknown primate species in North America that the forensic genetic record now contains. A DNA profile that should not exist is now in the forensic genetic record. The missing 411 disappearance pattern now has a biological candidate. The indigenous traditions that described these beings for generations now have a genomic foundation that Western science spent 2 centuries dismissing. The government's documented non-engagement with credible Bigfoot evidence becomes non-engagement with a species whose human-related ancestry raises questions about classification and rights that no agency has demonstrated any appetite for addressing. The Expedition Bigfoot results answer one question, the one that everything else depends on. Is there something out there? A forensic laboratory that processed a blind sample from a Pacific Northwest forest shelter confirmed that there is. It has a genome. It has been building shelters in those forests without appearing in any scientific record until this investigation arrived with the methodology rigorous enough to find it. It is still out there, and the results that confirmed its existence can no longer be made to disappear. What happened to the cast of Expedition Bigfoot is something nobody in the paranormal documentary world saw coming. Russell Acord, Bryce Johnson, Ronnie LeBlanc, and Dr. Mireya Mayor built one of the most serious and scientifically ambitious Bigfoot investigations ever put on television. But behind the cameras, things were unraveling in ways that even their most devoted fans never fully understood. Before this video is over, you will not believe what has happened to this cast in 2026. The full story starts right now. Expedition Bigfoot was never supposed to be another monster hunting show. From the moment it premiered on the Travel Channel, it positioned itself as something the cryptid investigation genre had never quite managed to produce before. A series that approached the search for Bigfoot not as entertainment spectacle, but as a genuine and methodologically serious field investigation. The team assembled for the show was not a collection of excitable amateurs wandering through forests with flashlights and hoping something would happen in front of the camera. Russell Acord brought military intelligence experience and tactical field expertise that gave the investigations a structured discipline most shows in this space could never legitimately claim. Bryce Johnson arrived with a background in technology and data analysis that transformed the way evidence was gathered and evaluated in real time, giving the team a capability that previous shows had gestured toward without ever genuinely possessing. Ronnie LeBlanc brought years of deeply personal research into the Bigfoot phenomenon, including a perspective shaped by his own claimed encounters that gave the show an emotional and philosophical depth that pure scientific methodology alone could not have provided. And Dr. Mireya Mayor brought the kind of academic credibility, a primatology background, and real field research experience with undiscovered species that made even the most committed skeptics sit up and take the work seriously. Together, they were not just a television cast. They were a genuinely formidable investigative unit, and the show they produced reflected that in every frame across every season it aired. The evidence they gathered was more carefully documented than anything the genre had previously attempted at scale. Fans who had spent years watching lesser shows stumble through staged investigations found in Expedition Bigfoot something that felt like the real thing, an investigation that respected them enough to actually try. And the audience they built was not a casual one. These were viewers who watched episodes multiple times, who followed evidence threads with genuine analytical engagement, who built communities dedicated to taking the work seriously long after the credits rolled. Then something changed. The energy shifted in ways the audience could feel, but not name. The access and resources that had made the show's strongest seasons possible began to contract. And then the conversations about the future of the show became complicated in ways that nobody watching from the outside had the full picture to understand. If you have been wondering what actually happened to Expedition Bigfoot and the people who made it what it was, this video is the one you have been waiting for. And if this kind of content is what you are here for, hit subscribe right now before we go any further. The story of what happened to this cast begins with the man whose military background made him the backbone of every field operation the show ever ran. Russell Acord's story is next. Russell Acord was exactly the kind of person that Expedition Bigfoot needed in order to be taken seriously by anyone approaching it with genuine skepticism. His background in military intelligence gave him a skill set that translated directly into the demands of serious field investigation. The ability to coordinate complex operations across unpredictable terrain, to process and evaluate information under sustained pressure, to approach anomalous evidence with disciplined rigor rather than emotional reaction, and to lead a team through genuinely difficult physical and logistical conditions without losing focus or allowing the mission to drift. When viewers watched Acord move through the wilderness on Expedition Bigfoot, they were watching someone operating at a level of genuine competence that the genre almost never gets to put on camera. He was not performing expertise. He had it. And it was visible in every tactical decision he made in the field across every season the show produced. The version of Acord that the audience watched commanding field operations week after week was real. But it was not the complete picture. What the camera could not show, what television by its nature is structurally incapable of capturing, was what was happening to Acord outside of the investigation itself. The years of fieldwork the show demanded were not easy years for anyone on the team. but for Accord they carried a particular weight that came from the specific nature of what his role required. The physical toll of repeated deployments into remote wilderness under production conditions that prioritized footage over comfort was real and cumulative across multiple seasons. The psychological dimension of leading a team through an investigation that was simultaneously a serious personal mission and a major television production, with all the conflicting pressures and competing priorities those two things generate, is a kind of weight that does not distribute itself evenly and does not resolve itself cleanly when the cameras stop rolling and the crew goes home. People who followed Accord closely during the run of the show began to notice the edges of something in his public presence that the episodes themselves were not capturing. There was a version of Russell Accord visible in interviews and social media and public appearances that carried the marks of a person navigating more than a television production. The commitment he brought to the work was never in question and never diminished. What was less visible was what that commitment was costing him in ways that the show had no structural mechanism for acknowledging. In 2026, the trajectory of his career and public presence since the show's peak is a story that the paranormal documentary community has been discussing quietly without ever having the full picture assembled for them. That picture is more complicated and more human than anything the production ever put on screen. Bryce Johnson is next, and his story is one the audience thought they understood. What was actually happening tells a very different story. Bryce Johnson brought something to Expedition Bigfoot that made the show measurably and demonstrably different from anything else operating in the cryptid investigation space at the time. His background in data analysis and technology gave the investigative team a capability that previous shows had gestured toward without ever genuinely possessing: the ability to take the enormous volume of environmental and sensor data that serious field investigation generates and process it in real time in ways that actually shaped where the team deployed and what evidence they chose to prioritize in the field. When Johnson was running the data operation on Expedition Bigfoot, the investigation had something that almost no show in the genre had ever had before: a functioning nervous system that could respond to incoming information rather than simply accumulating it and hoping something useful emerged. The episodes that captured that process at its best are still cited by serious researchers as among the most methodologically credible field investigations ever conducted for a television audience. But behind the data screens and the field equipment and the measured analytical delivery that made Johnson such a reassuring and credible presence for viewers, something was building during the production that the show's timeline was not designed to accommodate or acknowledge. The pace of Expedition Bigfoot was relentless in ways that people who have never been inside a major field production rarely appreciate from the outside. Multiple deployments per season, each one in genuinely remote and physically demanding terrain, each one generating enormous volumes of raw data that required sustained analytical focus to process meaningfully while the production clock continued moving forward regardless of what the evidence required. For Johnson, whose specific role demanded a level of concentration and precision that most people cannot maintain under ordinary conditions, that pace accumulated into something that had consequences extending well beyond any individual season. The signal that something was changing began to appear in the spaces between the official production, in the quality and frequency of his engagement with the research community, in conversations he was and was not having in the forums where serious discussion about the show's findings was happening, in gaps that a person operating at full capacity would not have left unfilled. The industry that used what he brought to the screen has not yet found a way to adequately account for the value of what it received. That imbalance is part of the story that has never been fully told. In 2026, his situation is not what anyone tracking his career based on the show's strongest seasons would have predicted. His capability did not diminish. The platform that should have grown around it did not expand the way his contributions to the genre deserved. Coming up, Ronnie LeBlanc. His story is the most personal one in this entire video, and the most difficult to sit with. Ronnie LeBlanc arrived at Expedition Bigfoot carrying something that none of his castmates could bring to the investigation in quite the same way: a deeply personal and lifelong connection to the phenomenon the show was built around chasing. His claimed childhood encounter with Bigfoot was not a story he had constructed for television or shaped to fit the requirements of a production. It was the foundational experience of his life, the event that had shaped his intellectual and spiritual development for decades before a camera was ever pointed in his direction, and the driving force behind years of independent research that had earned him genuine respect in serious Bigfoot research circles long before the Travel Channel came calling. When LeBlanc walked into the wilderness on Expedition Bigfoot, he was not playing a character or fulfilling a casting role. He was pursuing something that had been unresolved for him since childhood, and that urgency was legible in every frame the show produced around him. The audience felt it instinctively. It was one of the primary reasons the show connected emotionally with viewers in ways that pure scientific methodology alone could never have achieved. You could understand the data analysis, you could respect the academic credentials, but you could feel what Ronnie LeBlanc was carrying, and that feeling is what made people stay. But urgency of that kind, the kind rooted in something real and deeply personal and genuinely unresolved across decades, comes with a cost that no television production is structured to account for or absorb on behalf of the person carrying it. Each season that ended without a definitive answer to the question LeBlanc had been living with since childhood was not simply a narrative cliffhanger for viewers at home. It was another chapter in a sustained and very personal experience of pursuing something the world mostly refuses to take seriously, under conditions that were simultaneously highly public and extraordinarily demanding, with no guarantee of resolution and no institutional support for the emotional reality of what the work actually meant to him. Fans who engaged with LeBlanc, both on the show and in the wider research community, began to notice the weight of that accumulation in the years following the show's peak. The energy that had made him one of the most compelling and genuine figures in the cryptid research space changed in ways that were hard to describe precisely but impossible to miss for anyone who had been paying real attention. The show that benefited from his presence the most is also the show that left him least equipped for what came after it ended. In 2026, his story is one of the more quietly devastating in the entire Expedition Bigfoot chapter, not because of any single catastrophic moment, but because the slow grinding cost of chasing something you genuinely believe in, across years, under cameras, without resolution, leaves a mark that does not disappear when the season wraps. Dr. Mireya Mayor is next, and her story changes the entire picture. Dr. Mireya Mayor was the element that made Expedition Bigfoot structurally impossible to dismiss for anyone approaching it with genuine intellectual honesty. Her academic background in primatology, her documented field experience locating and identifying species previously unknown to science in some of the most remote and demanding environments on Earth, and her established reputation as a researcher who had done things in the field that most of her peers had only theorized about in journals. All of it combined to give the show a layer of credibility that no other program operating in the cryptid space had ever been able to legitimately claim. When Mayor assessed a piece of evidence on camera, it was not the enthusiasm of a true believer speaking. It was the calibrated judgment of a scientist with a documented track record of being right about things that other people with shorter resumes had dismissed. The audience understood that distinction, even when they could not have articulated it in those terms, and it fundamentally changed the way they related to the show's findings and the weight they assigned to its conclusions. What the audience could not see was the full complexity of what Mayor was managing outside of the investigation itself. The demands placed on a person of her professional standing by a high-profile paranormal television production are not simple or uncomplicated in any dimension. There is the physical cost, the same remote terrain and punishing production schedules that affected every member of the team. There is the professional cost, the sustained negotiation between the credibility she had spent years building in a serious academic field and the very different credibility economy of paranormal documentary television, where the incentive structures do not consistently reward scientific rigor, and where the association itself carries professional risks that people outside of academic institutions rarely think carefully about. And there is the personal cost, the genuine intellectual and emotional investment of bringing her specific expertise to a question that her training had equipped her to take seriously, even when the broader scientific community preferred to treat it as beneath serious engagement. Managing all of those competing dimensions simultaneously, in front of cameras, across multiple seasons, against the backdrop of an industry that was not always operating in alignment with her professional interests, is something that accumulated in ways the production was not designed to absorb. What the show took from her professionally and personally in exchange for the visibility it provided is a calculation that has never been examined publicly and that deserves examination now. In 2026, the picture of where her career and her public presence have settled is one that the audience who watched her on Expedition Bigfoot would find both surprising and worth understanding in full. Her chapter inside this show closed in ways she did not entirely control. The investigation that redefined everything comes next. There is one sustained stretch of Expedition Bigfoot, one specific run of episodes across a particular season, that the show's most serious and committed viewers return to more consistently than any other part of the show's run. Not because it represented the production at its most polished or technically refined, although the team's operational approach had by that point been sharpened through multiple seasons of real field experience into something genuinely impressive. Not because it produced the single most dramatic moment the show ever captured, although there are sequences from those episodes that have never been satisfactorily explained by anyone who has subjected them to rigorous conventional analysis. Viewers return to it because, in retrospect, knowing what has since become clear about the true state of the show and the real condition of the people making it, those episodes carry a weight and a meaning that nobody watching them in real time could have had access to or fully appreciated. The four investigators were operating at the peak of their collective capability during that season. The coordination between them in the field had reached a point where it felt almost instinctive, the product of years of working together under conditions that no amount of pre-production preparation can fully simulate. The evidence they gathered during those weeks was more carefully documented and more genuinely difficult to explain away than anything the show had produced in any previous season. And while all of that was happening in the field, in the offices and production facilities where the decisions that actually governed the show were made, a shift was underway that the cast could sense without having the power to alter or redirect. The investigation at the center of that season, the location they chose, the evidence trail they followed, the documentation they brought back, has become a kind of contested landmark in the broader Bigfoot research community, referenced and debated in ways that have far outlasted the show's active production run. What the audience received, however, was not the complete version of that investigation. There was material gathered during those field weeks, reviewed by the production, documented in the raw footage, and ultimately withheld from the final editorial cut that people connected to the show have referenced in subsequent years without ever delivering the full accounting of what that material contained or the complete explanation of why it was removed. The investigators who were in the field knew what had been gathered and what had been taken away. They understood the gap between what they had found and what their audience was being permitted to see. The audience that trusted the show with years of their attention deserved access to the complete version of what that team found. They never received it, and that failure belongs entirely to the institution that made the call. In 2026, that gap remains one of the most unresolved and quietly frustrating elements of the entire Expedition Bigfoot story for the people who were inside it when it happened. When Expedition Bigfoot went quiet, so did the people who made it. Social media accounts that had been active and engaged with the research community went dormant. Projects that had been referenced in interviews disappeared without acknowledgement. Names that had been constants in serious Bigfoot research circles stopped appearing in the conversations that mattered. The fans noticed immediately. Comment sections on archived episodes filled with questions nobody was answering. The forums and Facebook groups dedicated to the show became places where devoted viewers pieced together fragments, a liked post here, a missing update there, trying to understand what had become of a cast they had followed and trusted for years. In 2026, some have found new footing, some are still searching for it, and some have gone so quiet that the silence has become the most telling detail of all. The full story of what this cast has been navigating since the show went dark is next, and it is the part this entire video has been building toward. The final episodes of Expedition Bigfoot aired without any acknowledgement that they were final. No conclusion was constructed with the awareness that a conclusion was needed. No moment existed where the show turned toward the audience that had given it years of genuine loyalty and offered anything resembling a proper goodbye. It simply stopped. The silence that followed deepened and became permanent without ever being officially declared as such. Fans organized. They pushed back through every channel available to them. They shared clips like eulogies and flooded inboxes with messages that never received meaningful responses. The network said nothing of substance. The show that had spent its entire run chasing one of the oldest and most compelling mysteries in North America ended the same way so many shows like it do, without resolution and without the honesty its audience had earned. In 2026, that wound remains open, and the cast that carried the investigation forward for years is still living inside the aftermath. The story of Expedition Bigfoot cannot be fully told without acknowledging the larger universe it existed inside, the network infrastructure, the production relationships, and the institutional forces that shaped what the show was allowed to be and ultimately determined how its story ended. Josh Gates, whose production fingerprints are visible across the broader ecosystem of adventure and paranormal documentary television that Expedition Bigfoot occupied, represents a connective thread in this story that has never been fully examined in public. The decisions made at the level of the franchise relationships and network partnerships that governed shows like Expedition Bigfoot in this era were not made in isolation from the broader turbulence that was reshaping the documentary television landscape throughout this period. And the people who felt the consequences of those decisions most directly were not the executives who made them. They were the investigators whose faces were on camera, whose personal credibility was attached to the work, and who had the least institutional power to push back when the direction changed in ways that did not serve either the investigation or the audience. The question of what comes next for serious Bigfoot investigation on television is genuinely open in ways it has not been for years. The genre is not dead. The audience that Expedition Bigfoot built has not dispersed. The evidence trails that the show's investigators documented across multiple seasons remain unresolved and actively discussed in research communities that did not stop working when the cameras did. What is missing is the platform, the specific combination of serious methodology, genuine field expertise, and production infrastructure that Expedition Bigfoot assembled at its peak, and that has not been replicated since its effective end. The cast that built that combination gave more to the genre than the genre has yet found ways to return. Russell Accord gave it operational discipline and field credibility that money cannot simply purchase. Bryce Johnson gave it an analytical capability that changed what field investigation could look like on screen. Ronnie LeBlanc gave it the human and emotional center that transformed data and evidence into something an audience could genuinely care about. And Dr. Mireya Mayor gave it the scientific legitimacy that made it impossible to dismiss even for viewers who arrived with deep skepticism and every intention of leaving it intact. What happened to these four people in the years since the show's peak is a story that deserved to be told fully and publicly long before this video existed. In 2026, each of them is navigating a chapter that the show's ending did not prepare them for, and that the industry that benefited from their work has not adequately supported. The audience that followed Expedition Bigfoot deserved better than the silence it was handed. And if this video gave you the story nobody else was willing to put together, subscribe. There is always more. Dr. Mireya Mayor is a primatologist, a National Geographic explorer, a field scientist whose career has taken her into the most remote and most dangerous wildlife environments on Earth. She has studied great apes in Central Africa. She has conducted fieldwork in conditions that most researchers never experience once across an entire career. She does not use the word attacked lightly, she just used it. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what she says attacked her during this Expedition Bigfoot investigation has no explanation. When someone connected to a paranormal investigation television show claims they were attacked by an unknown creature during a field session, the claim enters a specific interpretive framework that the genre's history has built around it. The framework is skeptical by default, not because the claim is inherently implausible, but because the genre's commercial incentives create strong reasons for dramatic claims to be produced regardless of their evidentiary foundation, and because the audience that follows paranormal documentary programming has encountered enough manufactured drama to have developed a practiced skepticism about the most extreme claims any given production generates. Dr. Mireya Mayor's claim does not enter that framework in the same way that most paranormal investigation attack claims enter it. And the specific reason it does not is the reason her claim is the most significant attack account the Expedition Bigfoot production has ever generated. She is not a television presenter whose paranormal investigation background is the primary credential she brings to the claim. She is a working field scientist whose professional career was built entirely outside the paranormal television format, a primatologist whose fieldwork in Central Africa produced the discovery of a new species of mouse lemur that National Geographic documented in 2002, and whose academic and research credentials are assessed by the institutional scientific community against the standards it applies to fieldwork in the relevant disciplines rather than against the entertainment standards of paranormal television production. When Dr. Mireya Mayor says something happened to her in the field, the interpretive framework that surrounds the claim is not the paranormal television genre's framework of commercial incentive and manufactured drama. It is the framework of a professional field scientist whose relationship to accurate reporting of field events is governed by the same standards of honesty and precision that her academic career depends on. She knows the difference between what can be explained and what cannot. She knows the difference between an encounter that the biological reference of her primatology training accounts for and one that it does not. and she knows the difference between an experience that her professional communication standards permit her to characterize as an attack and one that requires a more careful or more qualified description. She used the word attack in the specific professional context that her credentials create around every public statement she makes about her field experiences. That word means something, and what it means and what the specific character of the attack she describes communicates about what Expedition Bigfoot encountered during the investigation this video documents is what the rest of this video establishes completely. To understand why what Dr. Mireya Mayor says about what happened during this Expedition Bigfoot investigation carries the specific weight it carries, it is necessary to understand what her professional background actually consists of, not the television presenter version of that background that the Expedition Bigfoot format has always provided to its audience, but the complete academic and field research record whose substance distinguishes her from every other person who has ever made a comparable claim in the context of a paranormal documentary production. She holds a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. Her dissertation research focused on primate behavioral ecology, the specific intersection of biological field methodology and ecological systems analysis that gives her the analytical framework for assessing the behavior of large primates in their natural environments with the precision that academic field research demands. Her fieldwork career prior to Expedition Bigfoot includes extensive time in Central Africa, documenting great ape populations in some of the most remote and most physically demanding field environments on the continent, environments whose specific demands on a researcher's physical endurance, situational awareness, and capacity to accurately assess threatening behavior from large primate species gave her the reference framework that her Expedition Bigfoot field experience has been drawing on. The mouse lemur species discovery she made in 2002 is not a marginal contribution to the field. It is the kind of finding whose documentation requires the sustained, methodical, scientifically rigorous field presence that the academic community's peer review process assesses against the highest standards of biological field research. National Geographic's decision to document the discovery reflects their assessment of its significance within the framework of the relevant scientific disciplines, an assessment that the academic community's subsequent engagement with the finding has validated. All of that, the PhD, the fieldwork history, the species discovery, the National Geographic credential, the academic institutional affiliation, is the foundation on which Dr. Mireya Mayor's assessment of what happened to her during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation this video documents rests, not the paranormal television genre's credibility framework, the scientific community's credibility framework, and what her professional assessment of the experience produced in terms of the specific language she chose to describe it. The word attack, delivered in the specific professional context that her credentials create, is the most significant communication the Expedition Bigfoot production has ever generated about the nature of what the investigation has been finding. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation deployment that produced the attack Dr. Mireya Mayor describes was not a standard session whose operational parameters and investigative objectives matched the template that the prior seasons had established. It was a targeted deployment organized around a specific intelligence picture, a convergence of prior field evidence from the deployment area, whose density and whose consistency across independent source categories the research team's assessment process had identified as the strongest location indicator the show had produced across its investigation history. The prior evidence from the area was not the ambiguous, source-uncertain type that the broader Bigfoot field research community's database contains in abundance. It was specific, physically documented, and assessed by the research team's analytical process against the evidentiary standards that Dr. Mireya Mayor's scientific background made the most demanding available to the production. Track evidence from the area showed dermal ridge detail and anatomical proportions that her primatology training identified as consistent with a large primate species, not consistent in the loose sense of a possible match with sufficient interpretive flexibility applied, but consistent in the specific technical sense of measurements and anatomical characteristics falling within the range that the primatological literature establishes for genuine biological impressions from primate species of the relevant size category. Acoustic evidence from the area had been documented across multiple independent recording sessions, whose temporal distribution ruled out single-source contamination, and whose harmonic analysis the production's audio specialist had characterized as consistent with vocal production from a species significantly larger than any known North American wildlife, and structural evidence, nest formations, branch manipulations at heights that excluded the known wildlife species of the area as possible sources. territorial marking whose geographic distribution indicated a resident population operating within a defined range, had been documented across the area in a pattern whose consistency Ronnie LeBlanc's accumulated field research had identified as unlike anything the prior season's most active investigation sites had produced. The deployment was built around that intelligence picture with the specific operational priority of advancing the investigation's evidence documentation into the most active zone the picture identified. Dr. Mireya Mayor's scientific framework was central to the deployment's evidence assessment plan. Her primatology background made her the person most qualified to characterize whatever the investigation's most active zone produced in real time and against the academic reference framework that her field research career had built. What the most active zone produced was not what the deployment plan had been designed around. It was something else. Something whose character Dr. Mireya Mayor's primatology framework registered not as evidence requiring careful scientific assessment, but as a threat requiring immediate physical response. Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of what happened during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's active field session is the account of a scientist whose professional communication standards apply to the description of a field event, the same rigor that her academic work applies to the characterization of research findings, which means that what she says happened is what her professional judgment determined happened within the evidentiary framework her training provides, rather than what the entertainment format she was working within would have been commercially incentivized to produce. The attack did not begin with a dramatic, cinematic confrontation, whose character the paranormal television format typically uses to produce its most extreme moments. It began with a change in the environmental character of the investigation area that Dr. Mireya Mayor's field experience registered as significant before any specific physical event had occurred. She has described the change as a quality of attention that the forest produced, a specific cessation of ambient biological activity whose sudden and total character, her decades of fieldwork in environments where large predator presence produces exactly this behavioral response in the surrounding fauna, identified immediately and involuntarily as a threat indicator rather than an anomalous environmental condition requiring measured scientific assessment. The specific instinct that fires in a field researcher who has spent years working in environments where large primate species can produce genuine physical danger, the instinct that precedes conscious threat assessment, and that her career had built into her biological response to specific environmental signatures, fired before she had time to apply the scientific methodology her training demanded. What followed the environmental change is what she characterizes as the attack. Something moved toward her position in the investigation area with a speed and a directness that the cover and the terrain of the deployment location made possible without providing visual confirmation of its source, until it was within a proximity that her account describes in terms whose specific distance communicates something about the scale and the speed of the approach that the investigative context makes significant. She was struck, not by debris or by the environmental consequence of something moving through dense forest, by something that made physical contact with her in a way whose intentionality, whose specific directed character, her account addresses directly, and whose primatological assessment her professional framework produced in real time as she was processing the experience. What made contact with her was not random. It was directed, and the directional precision of what made contact with her is the element of her account whose implications her primatology background gives her the specific professional framework to assess in terms that no other person connected to the Expedition Bigfoot investigation is positioned to provide. The most significant dimension of Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of the Expedition Bigfoot attack is not the physical event itself, the contact, the proximity, the speed of the approach. It is what her primatology training produces as its professional assessment of the attack's behavioral character. Because what distinguishes Dr. Mireya Mayor from every other person who has ever described an encounter with an unknown creature in a paranormal investigation context is not simply that her credentials are more extensive or her academic record more substantial. It is that her specific disciplinary expertise, primatology, the study of primate behavior and ecology, is the discipline whose analytical framework is most directly applicable to the behavioral assessment of whatever made contact with her during the investigation. She has spent her career studying how large primates behave, how they establish territorial boundaries, how they respond to perceived intrusions into those boundaries, how they communicate threat and dominance through specific behavioral sequences whose elements, the vocalization, the physical display, the directed approach, the contact, Her research has given her the reference framework to characterize with the precision that the academic literature her work contributes to demands. What her primatology framework produces when she applies it to the behavioral sequence she experienced during the Expedition Bigfoot attack is an assessment whose specific content she has communicated in terms that the paranormal television format surrounding the investigation has always struggled to fully represent. The attack was not random. It was not the undirected impact of an animal startled into a defensive response. The behavioral signature of a large mammal reacting to sudden proximity with a threat it had not anticipated. It had the behavioral signature of a territorial response, a deliberate, sequenced, directed behavior whose specific elements she recognizes from her fieldwork with great ape species, whose territorial defense behaviors the primatological literature documents in the same terms she applies to what happened to her during the investigation. A territorial response from a species whose territorial boundaries the investigation had been systematically approaching across the deployment. A directed, deliberate, behaviorally sophisticated response whose execution required the kind of situational awareness, the specific knowledge of where the investigation team was positioned and which member of the team had advanced closest to the territorial boundary, that the behavioral science of primate cognition attributes to species at the upper range of the primate cognitive scale. That is the assessment Dr. Mireya Mayor's primatology training produces about what attacked her. Not an animal, a primate, a large one whose territorial intelligence and whose behavioral sophistication in executing a directed territorial response against a specific individual at a specific position is consistent with the cognitive profile that the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's prior evidence record has been building across its seasons without being able to ground it in the kind of direct behavioral encounter that what happened to Dr. Mireya Mayor now provides. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation's camera deployment during the session in which the attack occurred was operating under the standard coverage protocol that the production uses for active field investigation sessions, multiple units covering the investigation area from overlapping angles whose combined documentation of whatever the session produces is designed to eliminate the single-camera artifact explanations that the skeptical community applies to anomalous footage from paranormal investigation productions. What the camera coverage produced during the attack is what Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of the event is corroborated by: the visual and audio documentation of the investigation session's most significant moments captured from independent angles in real time, without the post-production enhancement or framing that the broadcast format applies to the raw footage before it reaches the audience. The coverage documents the environmental change that Dr. Mireya Mayor's account describes as preceding the attack, the sudden cessation of ambient biological activity, the specific quality of forest silence that her field experience identified as a threat indicator. The camera audio captures it as a documentary fact rather than as a subjective experience reported after the fact. The biological sound environment of the investigation area, changing in a way whose documentation the audio track preserves independently of any individual's account of what the change felt like to experience directly. The coverage documents the approach, not the source of the approach. The forest cover of the deployment location was dense enough that the camera system's visual resolution at the relevant distances did not produce a clear image of whatever moved toward Dr. Mireya Mayor's position. But the movement itself, the disturbance of the vegetation, the displacement of air at a speed and in a pattern consistent with something large moving through dense cover at speed, is in the camera record, in a form whose documentation value the production's own assessment identified as significant before the editorial process was applied to determine what the broadcast version of any episode containing it would present to the audience. What Discovery Channel's editorial review of the footage produced in terms of the broadcast decision is what the prior pattern of the network's handling of the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's most significant evidence would lead anyone familiar with that pattern to predict. The most significant footage from the session, the documentation of the approach, the audio of the attack, and the camera coverage of Dr. Mireya Mayor's immediate post-attack condition and response, is not in any broadcast episode. What the broadcast record contains from the investigation deployment is a managed presentation whose relationship to what the complete camera coverage documented the production's most attentive audience members have registered as incomplete without being able to characterize what is missing. Dr. Mireya Mayor's account provides the characterization. Ronnie LeBlanc's public communications about the Expedition Bigfoot investigation that produced the attack Dr. Mireya Mayor describes are the second most significant body of evidence available about the event's character, because what LeBlanc says about the investigation and what he conspicuously does not say are both informative in specific ways, that his communication style and his accumulated public record on the Expedition Bigfoot investigation make legible to the audience that has followed the production closely. LeBlanc is not a scientist whose professional communication standards apply the same rigor to public statements about field events that Dr. Mireya Mayor's academic training applies. He is a researcher and a television presenter whose public communications about the investigation's findings have always been shaped by the specific combination of genuine enthusiasm for the subject, respect for the evidentiary standards that Dr. Mireya Mayor's scientific involvement has established for the production, and the practiced awareness of what the broadcast framework within which the investigation is presented will and will not accommodate in terms of the claims he makes publicly about what the investigation has found. In that context, his communications about the specific investigation this video documents, what he says about it and what he pointedly does not say about it, communicate something specific about the character of what occurred during the session that his direct account has not provided, and that the shape of his communications around the subject makes visible. He does not dismiss the attack. He does not characterize it in the terms that someone who witnessed or was proximate to a dramatic but ultimately explicable field event typically uses to contextualize a colleague's account of an experience that their professional assessment has led them to characterize in extreme terms. He does not say that what Dr. Mireya Mayor experienced was startling but ultimately accountable within the reference framework of known wildlife behavior in the deployment area. He says very little about the specific investigation at all, and the specific quality of that limited communication, in a presenter whose public engagement with the investigation's findings has otherwise been enthusiastic and extensive across the production's history, communicates something about the category of event the investigation produced during the relevant session that his silence defines more clearly than any direct statement could. Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of what attacked her during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation changes the show's complete evidence record in a specific and significant way, not by contradicting what the prior seasons have documented, but by providing the behavioral foundation on which everything the prior seasons have documented can now be understood in a new and more specific way. Every thermal signature the investigation has captured across its seasons, every heat return whose dimensions exceeded the biological reference range for known North American species, every movement pattern whose biomechanical characteristics Ronnie LeBlanc's field assessment identified as inconsistent with the known fauna of the investigation environments now has a behavioral correlate. The species that produced those signatures is capable of directed territorial response behavior, whose execution requires the situational awareness and the cognitive sophistication that Dr. Mireya Mayor's primatology framework identifies as characteristic of primate species at the upper range of the cognitive scale. That is not a minor addition to the evidence record. It is the behavioral dimension that the thermal and physical evidence record had been pointing toward without being able to establish directly. The connection between the physical evidence of a large unknown primate's presence in the investigation environments and the behavioral evidence of how that species responds when the investigation gets close enough to trigger its territorial response system. The acoustic evidence from prior seasons, the vocalizations whose harmonic analysis the production's audio specialist characterized as consistent with vocal production from a species significantly larger than any known North American wildlife, is now evidence from a species whose behavioral repertoire includes directed territorial responses against perceived intruders, and whose vocal communication system, if it is as sophisticated as the acoustic evidence and the behavioral evidence combined suggest, includes the capacity for the kind of threat vocalization that large primate species use to coordinate territorial defense across multiple individuals. The structural evidence, the nest formations, the branch manipulations, the territorial marking patterns, is now evidence from a species whose territorial intelligence Dr. Mireya Mayor's account establishes as sophisticated enough to identify specific individuals within an investigation team and to direct a territorial response at the individual whose position within the investigation area placed them closest to the territorial boundary. That is not the behavior of an animal. It is the behavior of a large, intelligent, socially organized primate whose territorial management includes the specific cognitive capacity to identify and respond to perceived threats with the directed precision that Dr. Mireya Mayor's account documents. Dr. Mireya Mayor went into those forests as a primatologist. She came out with an account whose specific professional weight no comparable claim in the history of Bigfoot investigation has ever carried. What attacked her was territorial, it was directed, it identified her specifically and responded to her position with the situational awareness that her academic framework attributes to primate species at the upper range of the cognitive scale. That is not an animal encounter. That is a behavioral confirmation. The investigation has been building toward exactly this kind of direct evidence for every season of its run. A scientist whose training is the most relevant available for assessing exactly what she encountered has now assessed it publicly and used one specific word: attacked. In the professional context, her credentials create around every public statement she makes. That word means everything. The search is not over. But what attacked Dr. Mireya Mayor in those forests has now been assessed by the one person most qualified to assess it. And the assessment changes everything.
For years, Dr. Mireya Mayor has been one of the most respected primatologists on television, a woman who traded high heels for muddy boots and chased wildlife through some of the most unforgiving jungles on Earth. On Expedition Bigfoot, she was the scientific anchor, collecting DNA samples, analyzing hair fibers, and keeping the team grounded in real biology. But after 3 seasons of unexplained findings, she stepped away from the spotlight. Until now, out of nowhere, Mireya has returned with new data, private recordings, and a warning that could redefine what we think lives in North America's forests. Subscribe for more cryptid investigations, because what she's about to reveal is no longer speculation, it's evidence. Long before television crews followed her into dense Appalachian hollows, Mireya Mayor's curiosity was forged in the heat, humidity, and wild overgrowth of southern Florida. Born to Cuban immigrant parents in Miami, she grew up at the edge of wetlands, where the neighborhood ended and the Everglades began. Her childhood wasn't filled with comic books or video games. It was frogs, wading boots, and field notebooks. She would kneel for hours along muddy canal banks, gently capturing anoles, dragonflies, even spiders most kids screamed at. Her mother used to joke that Mireya brought home more insects than groceries. Teachers noted she didn't just memorize answers, she demanded explanations. Why did certain birds change their songs at dusk? Why did water snakes surface after storms? Why did raccoons disappear from an area for days, then suddenly reappear in bulk? She didn't accept because nature is strange as an answer. At school, classmates saw a contradiction. She was athletic, graceful, even participated in dance. Yet she would sprint across a field to identify a distant bird call. She was the kind of child who noticed patterns others dismissed as coincidence. On her 12th birthday, her parents bought her a simple cassette recorder. That night, she crept outside and captured the sound of a mysterious low bellow echoing through mangroves. She played it constantly, analyzing tone and pitch shifts. Her science teacher chalked it up to alligators. Mireya disagreed silently and wrote, for the first time, the phrase she would revisit decades later. This voice has shape. When extended family gathered, her grandfather would whisper Cuban folk tales about hidden creatures in uncharted jungles. Most children would have had nightmares. Mireya had a notebook. As she entered high school, her focus shifted from general wildlife to primates. She saw behavior in monkeys, territorial pacing, vocal mimicry, branch anticipation, that mirrored some of the odd behaviors she'd seen from Florida's biggest animals. She wondered privately whether vocal complexity evolved around competition, not just communication. But what truly changed her trajectory happened at 15, during a volunteer trip to an isolated wildlife sanctuary deep in Panama. One night, while logging howler monkey activity, she heard something respond from far downriver. Deeper, slower, with a layered resonance no one could identify. Her mentor dismissed it as echo distortion. Mireya believed otherwise. She marked the direction, time, and tonal structure in her journal meticulously. Years later, rereading her notes, she realized she had documented something most scientists ignored: an unanswered conversation. Even then, she sensed a truth she couldn't articulate. Sometimes nature keeps secrets not to deceive us, but because we haven't learned how to listen yet. In 2001, early in her academic career, Mireya joined a primatology survey deep within the Congo Basin. The assignment sounded simple: document troop behavior in western lowland gorillas. But the rainforest had a way of turning simple objectives into uncomfortable questions. Almost immediately, things felt off. Every few nights, entire gorilla groups vacated prime feeding grounds without clear cause. There were no leopard tracks, no food scarcity indicators, and no signs of illness. They moved quietly, almost urgently, as if avoiding something that traveled by sound rather than sight. Local Mboko trackers, men who spent their lives reading forest language, whispered the name Mokele, meaning the one that watches from the trees. They didn't describe it as a monster. They described it as a pressure, a presence that changed the forest's pulse. Mireya didn't laugh, but she kept her notes scientific. Troop displacement, silence zones, uneven canopy agitation. One night, while documenting nocturnal calls, she recorded a vocalization unlike anything in her coursework. It was long, low, and layered, reaching frequencies below human speech. The sound resonated through the waterlogged soil, making her equipment vibrate. Her mentor dismissed it as a distorted buffalo call. Yet when she compared frequency patterns later, it didn't match any known species. It was too controlled, too intentional. The following morning revealed more anomalies. Foliage 5 meters high had been stripped and twisted, not clawed. A muddy impression in the riverbank lacked the curved toe arc seen in gorillas and chimps. Nearby, the carcass of a forest buffalo lay collapsed with no bite marks, only blunt force trauma. Predators tear. Something territorial breaks. Mireya cataloged everything carefully. Plaster casts, audio recordings, and location coordinates. But when she attempted to export the data back at camp, specific files were corrupted. Not everything, only the anomalies. Backup cassettes flickered with static gaps, as if something had interrupted them precisely where evidence mattered most. When she asked a seasoned ranger about the vocalization, he avoided eye contact and replied quietly, "When that voice comes, even the insects stop." On the flight home, she wrote a single unsettling line in her journal. "We recorded the reactions, not the source." She wouldn't realize for years how important that observation would become. When producers from Expedition Bigfoot first approached Dr. Mireya Mayor, she hesitated. She'd spent decades building a reputation through National Geographic fieldwork, primate research in Madagascar, and academic lecturing. One poorly framed television edit could undo years of credibility. But their pitch was different. They didn't want jump scares or staged drama. They wanted environmental DNA samples, thermal imaging analysis, and primate-based movement interpretation. They offered access to wilderness zones normally restricted by bureaucratic red tape. That access alone was invaluable. Once filming began, Mireya quickly noticed subtle biological patterns the cameras didn't catch. Elk herds were migrating earlier than expected. Bears avoided certain valleys despite abundant forage. Tree breaks appeared consistently between 7 and 9 feet high. Not storm damage, but leverage. And eyewitness testimonies were remarkably consistent. Loggers, hunters, and wildlife techs described shoulder sway, midfoot pressure, lateral pacing, and avoidance behavior. These weren't campfire embellishments. They were behavioral hallmarks of an intelligent, cautious primate. Off camera, she collected samples meticulously: saliva from snap branches, coarse hairs caught on bark, and syringed soil from fresh depressions. Chain of custody was strict. She sent several samples to independent labs under blind identifiers to avoid bias. Most reports returned as inconclusive, but 2 came back with mitochondrial sequences showing primate ancestry that didn't match any species listed in North American wildlife databases. Then something odd happened. A lab technician emailed her excitedly about one hair sample's unique medulla structure. 24 hours later, he followed up with a brief message asking her to disregard his previous comments. A week later, his lab no longer accepted third-party sequencing requests. That wasn't coincidence. It was pressure. During production meetings, Mireya noticed editorial pacing changed whenever evidence leaned too strongly toward biological plausibility. Thermal shapes were trimmed, spectrogram analyses shortened. The audience saw mystery. The scientists saw patterns. Late nights, she cross-referenced data against primate territorial displacement theory. Everything pointed the same direction. Something had disrupted habitat further north. Something big, persistent, and unfamiliar. Quietly, she wrote a sentence in her journal. This species isn't hiding from us. It's moving away from something else. And for the first time, television and science felt dangerously aligned, but not for the reason viewers thought. During a late-season shoot in the Appalachian foothills, Mireya noticed something unusual on a snapped branch roughly 6 feet above the ground. At first glance, it looked like sap, but under her headlamp, it reflected dark red. The height alone ruled out deer, and the branch was freshly twisted, not broken by storm or animal browse. Using a sterile swab, she collected the sample and immediately sealed it. The cameras rolled, but production focused on the dramatic search visuals, not the quiet, clinical precision happening off to the side. When the blood work came back, it raised more questions than answers. Hemoglobin density was higher than any known North American mammal. Iron content suggested a diet rich in leafy vegetation, but there were traces of nitrogen levels typically linked to high protein consumption. Herbivore chemistry layered over omnivore metabolism. Even stranger, the erythrocytes lacked certain markers found in bears and primates. It was a biological outlier. Mireya requested a second panel from a private lab. This time, the sample returned flagged under non-standard morphology. A technician quietly called her after hours to warn that further analysis might trigger institutional review. He refused to elaborate. The next morning, his contact info had been scrubbed from the lab directory. Back on location, the forest felt tense. Birds stopped calling near the ridge where the sample was collected. Coyotes circled lower elevations, avoiding the area entirely. It wasn't fear of humans, it was avoidance of something else. When the episode aired months later, the blood sample never appeared, not even a mention. Viewers saw eerie nights, distant knocks, and thermal silhouettes. They didn't see the one piece of evidence that made Mireya's stomach drop. The network said it lacked broadcast clarity, but to Mireya, it felt like the first hint that some discoveries weren't meant for prime time. She wrote a note in her field journal that night. Blood is honest, edits aren't. After 2 seasons of fieldwork, Mireya began noticing a pattern that didn't fit the narrative the public assumed. Most viewers pictured Bigfoot as a static creature buried deep in remote forests, rarely moving, occasionally revealing itself. But when Mireya plotted every credible sighting, physical trace, and unexplained vocalization across a decade of Park Service reports, something emerged that chilled her more than any roar in the dark. The pattern was shifting south. These weren't random dots on a map. They formed a corridor, an ancient ecological highway once used by megafauna like giant ground sloths and early bison. It stretched from dense evergreen regions of Washington down through Oregon, across the Rockies, and into the Appalachian interior. The northern perimeter of the corridor became increasingly quiet. Sightings that once clustered in British Columbia tapered off. Camera traps in the Pacific Northwest went silent. Meanwhile, activity in Kentucky, Tennessee, and northern Georgia skyrocketed. At first, critics argued better reporting explained the change. But deer populations, mountain lion dispersal zones, and black bear feeding patterns, species with consistent behavior, remained stable. Only one curve moved dramatically. Encounters involving a tall, upright, primate-like figure. Mireya cross-referenced the pattern with climate data. Winters in the north were becoming erratic, freezing late, thawing early, destabilizing food chains. Habitat collapse pushes species along their most efficient pathways. But this corridor wasn't new. It was ancient. Something had used it before. She dug deeper into historical accounts. Indigenous oral traditions described forest people retreating south when northern winds changed. Trapper diaries from the 1800s mentioned the walkers, moving away from bitter cold. Whatever this species was, migration wasn't panic. It was instinct. The most troubling clue came from recent eyewitness testimony describing limping gaits and open wounds. Mireya flagged multiple cases in which the creature appeared injured, with matted fur at the shoulder or swelling near the knee. Migration isn't just movement, it's displacement. Predators don't cause slow migration, they cause retreat. She presented this quietly to a small circle of wildlife ecologists, half shrugged, cautious of reputation. The other half went silent. One biologist asked a single question. If they're leaving the north, what replaced them up there? That question infected her thinking. A shy species doesn't uproot without pressure. Something bigger, or louder, or hungrier had entered their territory. In her field journal, she wrote, "We're not watching a myth spread. We're watching a boundary collapse. And boundaries, once broken, rarely reform." In late 2022, months after cameras stopped rolling, a nondescript padded envelope arrived at Mireya's university office. No return address, no explanation. Inside was a sterile forensic swab, sealed in polymer, and labeled only with GPS coordinates from deep within the Pacific Northwest. A single note was folded beneath it, sequenced from branch saliva. "Run quietly." Curiosity outweighed caution. Mireya logged the swab under a generic field code and sent it to a private sequencing lab she trusted, one known for studying remote primate populations. She asked for full genomic analysis. 2 weeks later, the lab's automated portal flagged the file as ready. When she opened the report, her heart sank. The genome showed a 97% similarity to Homo sapiens, similar to how gorillas overlap genetically with us. But several gene clusters were unlike anything in published databases. One cluster suggested reinforced skeletal density, specifically in the upper limbs. Another indicated elongated hyoid structure, allowing deeper, more resonant vocalization. A third flagged increased collagen density, implying unusual durability in connective tissue. Then came the most shocking annotation. Chromosome 2 fusion markers appeared similar to human, but with structural differences implying an older divergence event, not a recent mutation. If true, this would place the species on a branch of our family tree long assumed extinct or undiscovered. When Mireya requested deeper sequencing, the portal refused, her login credentials locked. Hours later, she received an email citing potential biohazard breach and informing her that all further inquiry must be routed through a federal bioethics review panel. That panel, on paper, didn't exist. A day later, the lab technician who initially processed the swab called her from a personal number. Whispering, he warned her never to mention the sample publicly. "It's real," he said, "and it's older than us." Before she could ask questions, he hung up. That evening, Mireya drove home feeling watched, not followed, observed. When she returned to campus the next morning, her office door was ajar. Nothing was missing. Everything on her desk, however, had been subtly rearranged, as if someone searched for a hidden device and wanted her to know. She backed up the data onto a private drive and encrypted it. Days later, her university's legal department issued a memo advising all faculty to avoid unverified zoonotic research. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. That night, she wrote only 2 words in her field journal: "Genetics confirms." And beneath that, a quiet realization: if this species is real, then its silence has a reason. As Mireya pursued quiet conversations with park biologists and backcountry conservation officers, she began hearing whispers about something she initially assumed were campfire rumors: ranger disappearances. Official reports labeled them as hypothermia, falls, or failure to return from patrol. But patterns emerged the more she listened. One ranger in Washington vanished after responding to a late-night call about heavy pacing near a campground. His radio captured only 4 words before cutting into static: "It's walking upright." His body was found 2 weeks later at the base of a ravine with no fractures consistent with a fall. The official report omitted that detail. Another ranger in Northern California reported strange, rhythmic knocks echoing across a valley, 3 at a time, precisely spaced. He joked with co-workers that it sounded like communication. Days later, he failed to check in during a routine trail sweep. Search parties found his gear neatly stacked against a tree, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. His boots were 200 yards away, pointing uphill like he'd been running or chased. But the case that disturbed Mireya most happened in 2014. A senior ranger, respected, experienced, calm under pressure, filed an internal memo requesting additional patrol resources near an area of infrasound anomalies. He noted wildlife fleeing downhill and sudden silence zones where insects ceased. Weeks later, he disappeared during patrol. His body was never recovered. The memo was quietly archived under Wilderness Acoustic Confidential. The classification wasn't standard. When Mireya requested anonymized case summaries from a contact within the National Park Service, the file arrived with 90% of the text redacted. Only one phrase remained readable: vocal signatures inconsistent with known fauna. At a private symposium, an older ranger approached her quietly, hands trembling. He confessed that during his career, he'd encountered large, upright figures watching from ridge lines, never approaching, always observing. He said something she'd never forget. "We don't manage the wildlife out there. We manage the panic." 2 weeks later, that same ranger retired early and declined all interviews. As sightings shifted south, these disappearances followed the same corridor Mireya mapped: injured wildlife, disrupted migration, missing patrol personnel. All of it pointed toward pressure building in the remote north. In her field journal, she wrote, "Rangers act as early warning systems. When they vanish, something has crossed the line." The question hanging over her research wasn't just what existed in the forests, it was what changed, forcing the quiet species to move, and why authorities worked so hard to keep the public from seeing the pattern. During an off-camera research trip to Kentucky's Red River Gorge, Mireya set up a lone campsite near an old logging trail. Just after 2 a.m., her equipment triggered from a sudden vibration in the soil. Not footsteps, but a low, pulsing resonance. Moments later, a screech tore across the ravine, dipping into subsonic frequencies her recorder barely captured. Spectrogram analysis later revealed 2 vocal folds vibrating independently, something only select primates can do. For nearly 40 minutes, something paced a perfect circle around her tent without breaking brush or snapping twigs. Intelligent movement, intentional distance. At dawn, she found twisted branches marking the perimeter, like quiet territorial boundaries. Months later, Mireya quietly assembled a panel of acousticians, field biologists, and geneticists. Their conclusion was sobering. Climate stress and territorial pressure will force this species toward populated forest edges within the decade. She believes contact is inevitable, not because the creature wants it, but because something else now occupies their northern habitat. In a recent closed-door symposium, she stated, "When shy species move, dominant ones arrive." It's not myth, it's succession. She's no longer asking for belief. She's preparing for the announcement no one is ready to make.